The Space God Memoirs. Episode 11. I sat upon the back of the cart, looking out over the flat plains that lay between us and Ganadria. There, yellow grass grew in patches over chalky white earth, which would billow and cloud up when a wind blew from above. I just watched as the wind caressed the grasses and rustled the dust, my head lowered and my mind frazzled. Burge and Rayleigh were both up front, slowly leading Gildar down the trail. The knights rode a few paces ahead of us, keeping steady on their muscular hulzars. Occasionally one would ride ahead, vanish from sight, and then circle back to us. Probably scouting for more EO, I guessed. Bakibra would occasionally check up on us, but the two male knights largely kept to their own company. I did learn that the blue one was named Jedis and the gray one was Vorse, but they seemed as inclined to talk to me as I was to them. I had just been knocked out and nearly killed before witnessing a devastating battle between some of the most jacked up people on the planet. So it would stand to reason that I would feel a bit out of sorts. But that wasn't really it. My mind was still on Zirathra. What the scrag had happened to her? Did she just calmly walk away from a squad of evolved ones? That fanatical bug lover interrogating me sure seemed to think so. But he also thought she was some kind of holy being. Any normal person would be dead, or at least being held captive and tortured. But she wasn't normal. That was for sure, whoever she really was. And what exactly had happened to me back there? Was I just drugged? Hallucinating? How much of that wonky scene had actually happened? And most of all, why did I care? Zirathra was a relative stranger, if a rather attractive one, and in my life, people came and went. So what if she ditched me? So what if she was dead or alive? People disappeared all the time out in the wilds, and I had learned long ago to not get all shook up over them. That's the dug of crap I told myself. And it worked, at least for that moment. Enough for me to let out a deep sigh, straighten my back, and hock a loogie off the cart. Keph, began Rayleigh, climbing over the cart seat and metal junk between us. She's fine. The girl said she knew folks in Ganadria. She probably just figured she was getting close enough to the city and left without us. But, I protested. She wouldn't have done that. We had a connection. Rayleigh rolled her eyes. Whatever. That chick was a weird one. Probably just using you for the convenience. She was a fellow traveler in need of assistance, I said, only half believing it. Plus, I straight up saved her life. I don't think she'd just ditch me. I'm surprised she didn't swear a life debt to me. No. Instead, she disappears when the EO show up, leaves you for dead. I still don't know what really went down there. I was all drugged, and she did tell Bakibra about me. Small compensation. Honestly, she was shady from the get-go. Said she was going to Ganadria. Never even told us who she was meeting there, especially not King Scragging Rudis. And who in the Green Ocean is from Uzel? That whole country is fictional as far as I'm concerned. Rayleigh shook her head. If you had such issues with Z, you should have said something during the trip. You seem to get along for the most part. I have no idea why, said Rayleigh with a tisk. Really, we should have left her there at that wacko convention she was attending. Not sure what came over me saying you could take the random tall blue girl along. Normally I'd just tell someone like that to scrag off, but I guess something came over me. Maybe she hit me with the same wacky juice they must have got you with on the ridge. I sighed, feeling in no mood to argue with the fired-up Rayleigh. She was probably right after all. I plopped my ass down on the back of the cart as it continued to descend the last bits of the hill that led into the plains. Well, she's gone, I told myself. I figured at the time that I'd probably never see her again. She was likely already regretting our time together, feeling remorseful for dirtying herself with some wanderer, probably off to mingle with her noble Ganadrian friends as she tried to forget it all. But was she? Who the scrag exactly did she even know in Ganadria? Who was Zirathra? Did she have a family? Friends? Yeah, foreign chick from a foreign land, but she didn't have an accent and never got into specifics. It was probably the weirdest, if also the hottest, person I had ever met. Part of me could barely believe any of it was real. My trip with that lovely being ending in this abrupt departure. Zirathra, so perfect, so delicate and yet strong, so unsuited to this filthy place, vanishing like she had never been, like the mirages of a desert journey or the hallucinations of an addict. But that part of me was naive and maybe delusional. No, I told myself firmly, I would not scragging pine over a girl. That wasn't me. I was not that guy. I shook it off with a huff. Reaching into my pocket, I took out one of the gems from Suldra and gave it a good look in the sunlight. This is what I needed to focus on. The future. The project. Soon I'd be flying, free, and probably wealthy. Plenty of girls to be had then. We were about an hour's travel into the Ganadrian plains, the forested ridge still visible behind us, when I noticed the knights slowing their pace ahead. Moments later, Knight Captain Bakibra was riding back to our cart. She stopped in front of us, removing her helm. "It is good to see you are all safe," she said. "I apologize, for travel these past few months has been more troublesome among these roads. The evolved ones have been unusually active of late." "Yeah," I said. "We saw more than a few of them on our way up here. What's the deal with that?" "I know not. I do know that they have stepped up their blood contests in nearly all of the towns. Their doomsayers are more numerous as well. Even in Ganadria they preach their rubbish. A year ago, Trebos the Slayer and his ilk would not have dared come this close to the city. Their agents seem even more keen on rooting out blasphemers and technologists now. Technologists like yourselves, it seems." She looked at her cart and gave a knowing nod. I began, trying to come up with a convincing lie, though mostly out of habit. The KOG were no tech haters, after all. "Yes, we're inventors, Captain," said Rayleigh, beating me to it. "We've a lab up in the city, and we're just returning back after scavenging some parts from down south." "Ah," replied the knight. "Our Lord Protector always seeks to keep Ganadria a refuge for invention." "I know," said Rayleigh. "Our lab chief, Ven, already has a petition to demonstrate our work before King Rudis once it's finished." "I see," nodded the knight. "Then I wish you well on your pursuits. I will put in a good word with the relevant officials. Perhaps your petition will be moved along." "Still," added Bakibra, shaking her head, "I would be wary of discussing your work openly, even in Ganadria. The mood in court has been tense lately. While the evolved ones are banned from the walls of the city, their teachings have gained traction among some of the lower castes of people, and even a few among the king's own advisors. I will do my best to encourage a meeting, yet I am unsure if it will be granted any time soon for you." "Why is that?" asked Rayleigh. "The whole of it is not for me to say. Our forces have been rather occupied as of late. In addition to the evolved ones, there are uprisings among the savage Glus of the Vale, and all manner of strange sights in the skies. This past fortnight all of our knights were called back from their missions, though I know not the cause. There's a growing madness in these lands, and it is uncertain where it will take us. All I can do is caution you not to get caught up in it." Bakibra sighed. In this light, out on the open plains, I could see how tired she looked. heavy circles under her eyes, her face carrying a few more lines than I would have expected from a woman her age. I wondered how old Bakibra was anyway. That armor tended to take its toll on people. I hadn't heard of many knights living past 30. She looked away, towards the nearby trail, where her fellow knights waited. "I suppose we should get going," said Bakibra, then put her helmet back on and rode back to Vors and Jedis. All of us covered our faces in our cloaks as we continued a slow march across the plains, which took up another few hours of our time. For nearly an hour we walked through howling winds and blowing dust, catching occasional glimpses of the knights just ahead. Soon after that, we once more joined up with a proper road, and it wasn't long before we began passing other travelers, mostly merchants and fellow scrappers. There, I once more beheld great Ganadria City, so-called last bastion of civilization, the predominant city-state of the plains. The view was unmistakable. A giant, rust-colored skull rose above the surrounding plains, a metal head that was itself larger than any of the river towns. As we approached the city, its visage stared down at us, with eye sockets that now held 2 stained glass windows, grinning its 100-yard smile. Ganadria had been built around the wreck of a freaky big robot, something not all that different from the Hulk we had in our cart, but on a mountain-straddling scale. I didn't know what it was used for back in the day, but figured it had to be some kind of weapon or defense like the other metal hulks. Maybe back in those days, the ocean was filled with giant-sized monsters that crawled out of the sea and wrecked cities, so people needed huge robots to fight them. Just a guess, and probably not a good one. Whatever the truth was, sometime during or right after the Retribution, the robot had collapsed here in these plains and never got back up. A city had grown up around its immense mechanical corpse. From our vantage point, it shone with a muted, steely gleam, the afternoon sunlight reflecting off of its oldest structures, which predated the Retribution. Though mostly metal, it was covered over with the rust of centuries and faded with disrepair. Up above, enormous hafts protruded at odd angles, ending in rivets or inset with crumbling gears. Some looked to have once held cranes, pulley systems, or some other contraptions of the old days. Banners and tapestries now hung from where machines once likely grinded and worked away, the green and white flag of Ganadria prominent among them. Off to the right side of the head, one of the old robot's arms stood, raised to the sky, its hand rusted into a fist. It now functioned as a tower. More of Ganadria appeared as we rode further down the road. The muddled browns and grays of the newer city, all made of wood scraps and stacked stones, the largest of the buildings not half the height of the skull. The city wall was built of the same stone. Gates of rusty iron stood open, rising up about 20 feet to near the wall's apex. A throng of folks stood in line, waiting to enter. They probably numbered just over 200 by my crude estimate. A crowd of largely regular people, a mix of those from the river towns and the city. The former differentiated from the latter by their muddier and more ripe-smelling clothing. There were also the merchants, men and women in bright garments dyed from the flowers of the southern plains, their carts jingling with metal scrap like my own, or clanking with the pottery made from the Ganad's ever-beloved mud. "Damn scragging crowds," I muttered, shaking my head. "Waiting in line like this makes me feel like Dugga being herded." Same as always," replied Burge, shrugging his huge shoulders. "Well, we'll be home soon enough." The stink of mingled odors assailed us as we drew ever closer to the gate itself. The sounds of hundreds of voices and at least 4 dialects all clashing and cascading off of one another to form an alien-sounding cacophony. We Reubens were a varied bunch. There were chicks with horns, big, bare-chested guys with scaly skin, a few people with spiny crests going from their heads to their butts, or other rare features. Most people were among the olive-skinned river folk, mixed in with people of green, ochre, and crimson skin tones, and more. I even spotted a few gray skins like myself, rare in these parts but not unheard of. For a moment, as my eyes passed from person to person, I thought I caught a glimpse of azure blue skin under a white-cowled robe. See? A shiver ran down my spine, but an instant later the person melted into the crowd. Whoever it was, I didn't spot them again in that multitude.
This way,
said Bakibra, gesturing towards the left of the main gate, to a solid metal door that stood closed, with only a few people standing near it. Thus we ignored most of the gate throng, skirting the edges of the crowd. We stopped at the closed doorway for only a moment. Knight Captain Bakibra muttered a few words into her suit's intercom. In a few seconds the door swung open by itself, revealing a short tunnel lit by flickering electrical lights. The door shut behind us as we entered. Moments later, we were out of the tunnel and into the city. As the shadow of the city wall passed behind us, we stepped into the fullness of Ganadria. I could already hear the shouting of market hawkers and the clatter of 1,000 boots on stone as we stepped into Ganadria's central square, under the shadow of the great iron skull that now served as the palace of King Rudis. A few hundred yards ahead of us stood the entrance to said palace, where a grand archway rose, flanked by ancient metal turrets rusted into place. Riding out of the archway were more knights, at least 10 of them, their mechanical suits in a veritable rainbow of colors. The company stopped just in front of the palace, positioning themselves between the two old turrets. Bakibra once more turned to us.
"This is where I must leave you," she stated. "I assume that you know your way around the city."
I nodded, as did the others.
"Then farewell,"
she said.
"I will put in a good word with the king for you."
And with those words, Knight Captain Bakibra turned her mount around and rode towards her fellow knights, Jedis and Vorse trailing behind her. We all stood there for a few more moments, my eyes fixed on the company of knights in all their diverse colors, heraldry, and weapons. It was a rare sight seeing so many of the KOG in one place. Usually there were only a few in the city. Bakibra hadn't been lying when she said they'd all been called back from their missions. Even living in Ganadria part-time, it was hard not to acquire a certain respect for the knights, which in some people rose to the level of reverence. Rayleigh couldn't keep her eyes off the gathered party. Neither could I, but I also noticed a few of them were looking our way, and occasionally gesturing. Now, Bakibra and the boys might have been perfectly polite on our journey, but another thing you learned in Ganadria was that the knights could be trouble. Give people power armor that increased their strength, plus the authority to arrest and even kill people, and you were bound to create a few crazies. Some even said that the armor drove them mad, if it didn't kill them first. So us regular folk tended to stay clear of the KOG. They might have been valiant, noble heroes for sure, but heroes also tended to break stuff if you got in their way. "Yup," I said. "Time to head out. No use lingering here." "Might as well head straight for the lab," said Burge. Rayleigh and I were both in agreement, so we took the second street on our left, then a shortcut through one of Ganadria's larger alleys, overhung by a long rope decorated with sundry hanging bottles, cans, and chimes. We pushed through, jostling past a half-dozen ragged beggars, a few who shouted obscenities at me as I went, and sidestepped a rather nasty, rust-covered piece of scrap before we came out the other end. The alley emerged into the southern end of Wheaton Circle, the city's biggest marketplace, where at that moment at least 1,000 people gathered in even more diverse varieties than at the gates. Roughly defined by a circle of standing stones at the intersection of 4 roads, the market ringed, shouted, and clattered with activity. There were tribesmen from the western dunes, so decked out in their chitin armor that they barely looked like people. There were a few families of Gluss, folks with matching green hair and eyes that were residents of the lowlands northwest of Ganadria. I even saw a single red-skinned man with an extra head growing out of the side of his neck, who stood astride a small stage next to one of the obelisks, juggling pins. "Let's keep to the outskirts," Rayleigh said. "I got no desire to see our haul stolen by some pickpocket." Burge let out a yawn. "And I got absolutely no energy to get hassled by merchants, that's for sure." Thus we kept to the edges of Wheaton Circle, which was nonetheless filled with crowds of traveling folk. Merchants in colorful, multi-layered clothing shouted at us to try their new goods, from yellow-veined meat of questionable origins to sweet-smelling medicine in glass bottles. On our left, as we circled the market northward, was a large wooden platform with numerous built-in cages. Most held chittering beasts that clicked and chortled. But 2 cages were packed to the brim with people, bare naked, huddled together, most looking broken and dead-eyed as they stared out at the ogling crowd who shouted to the yellow-clad gentleman standing at the stage's podium, ready to sell them slaves. Not far from that living meat market was the pleasure sector, a gathered collection of red tents. Outside of them, prostitutes lounged upon cushioned couches, waiting for prospective customers. They were guarded over by several towering, scale-covered men who could probably fit in well with my Rusha. Nearby, the ground was dug out for several fighting pits, their rims lined with spikes. I could hear the sounds of grunting and clashing from within. More slaves, or as the Ganadrians called them, the disowned, those who had been stripped of their rights by trial or decree of the king or his knights. Ganadria, I knew, could be just as much of a shithole as any of the river towns. One more reason to be careful around its protectors. But soon we had walked out of sight, the sounds of agony fading into those of the noisome masses. Moving without a glance at the outlying market vendors, we passed under a tall stone arch and headed northwest along a hard-packed gravel road that weaved diagonally between mixed buildings of mud brick, wood, and scrap plastic. The crowds died down rapidly as we passed into the poorer part of town, until they had receded to the occasional hooded beggars, bottom-tier prostitutes, or ragged street kids, many of them with clear mutations. We kept walking, past teetering buildings that looked no better than the ruins of old Soldra. After rounding one final street corner, there it was, the lab. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Space God Memoirs. Space God is written, performed, and produced by A.M. Arctos. Original musical score by Alpha Colors. Various sound effects created by Industrial Strength Records Incorporated. Please support this podcast by following, rating, and sharing on your favorite social media site. For further info on Space God, its creator, and various other opinions, musings, and thoughts, go to www.spacegodmemoirs.com or follow me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. If you enjoyed the Space God Memoirs, please consider supporting us by becoming a patron. Check out the Patreon link in our description to learn more.